Afternoon Talk on SAFM.
Yeah, lots to talk about. And tell you what, probably, how about this one here? What do you think we as South Africans can learn from China? How's that for a big question as to what can South Africa learn from China? 0891 104 207, 0891 104 207. The SMS is 34701. That will cost you R2. You can also tweet me your answers, or tweet Ashraf Garda1 if you follow me, and you can also comment on Facebook. Somebody already said, well, we can learn about cheap child labor as one of the things we can learn. And as we talk, I know there's a delegation in China right now from South Africa. President Zuma, of course, getting to the country as well in a couple of weeks' time. So I'd like to get your opinion. We have Dr. Martin Davies talking to me about that. I will get to him in just a second or two. And this being a Tuesday, we go tech media from 2:30 to 3. So lots of issues around technology, including the discussion around BlackBerry and its future, and the MTN National Long Distance Optic Network, whatever that means. And what about some of the other gadgets and apps that we'll be talking about all over the next, half an hour from 2:30 to 3. And then in the spotlight today is the Miss South Africa, who does not want to compete in the Miss World. That's Melinda Bam, of course, Miss South Africa, my guest, in the spotlight after 3 o'clock. So that's it. Your number to call in, 0891 104 207. What indeed can South Africa learn from China? So with me, Martin Davies, Dr. Martin Davies, who's the Chief Executive Officer at Frontier Advisory. Good of you to come in, Martin. Thanks for your time. Right?
Thank you, Ashraf.
Right, so it's such a broad question, because I'm just thinking, in the past, because I think yesterday we had this discussion, talking about languages, by the way, that the paradigm has always been, well, it works if it's in the USA and it works if in the UK and Europe. But that, as we know, is not the case. Increasingly so now, more and more people are looking towards Asia, naturally, and China specifically. So in broad strokes, and what in fact can South Africa learn from China?
Thanks, Ashraf. Well, clearly, with the onset of the Western financial crisis in 2008, the balance of power has certainly shifted towards should we say, away from the spenders to the savers, and clearly China's at the top of that list. China's currently the world's second biggest economy. And increasingly, China is having a dramatic impact and influence on Africa's own economic trajectory. They're the largest trading partner, largest investor in Africa, the largest lender to African governments, and also the single largest financier of infrastructure in Africa. So clearly China's important for Africa.
Indeed. And I'm suggesting even up front now, it didn't happen by chance.
It certainly hasn't. This is a long-term, dare I say, strategic play on behalf of the Chinese government, Chinese sovereign wealth, and Chinese leading corporations coming to Africa. But I think, coming to your question is I think in growth challenging times we're living in now, how does an economy, I'm thinking China, how does an economy get on average 10% growth every year for 3 decades?
Yeah.
At the same time uplifting substantially the lives of over 1 billion people. What is the recipe for that? What is the political, social economy? What's the recipe, if you will, for high growth, truly developmental, trickle-down economy? I think that taking your question one step further, that's the question we should be asking.
Indeed. So what can we learn in terms of what is that recipe? Because we're grappling with our own issues right now. But you're saying there's been virtually sustained growth now over a period of a long, long time. So what then are those ingredients?
Well, let me just put this in context. I would argue currently that South Africa is probably the country or the economy from a policy perspective that is seeking to understand, and B, emulate, implement the Chinese model, whatever that, if there is such a thing as a model. In August 2010, President Jacob Zuma was in Beijing. Subsequent to the last 2 years or so, almost 2 years, almost every member of the ANC's National Executive Committee has been to China on so-called learning journeys, trying to figure this out.
And rightfully so, you would say?
I would say definitely rightfully so. Clearly the models are not coming out of Western Europe anytime soon. So I think that's to be applauded. I think, however, to try and understand a very complex public sector management system in a week or 2 weeks is impossible. So we call it in this country, the developmental state.
Yeah.
I would argue the developmental state, as we're conceptualizing it, trying to implement it, is effectively maybe a China model light trying to be implemented in this part of the world. Are we getting it right? I think the notion of, we've seen recently the Sims document, was spoken about at the ANC policy conference last week, the state intervention in mining document. I think we are perhaps misinterpreting the model to an extent. We talk about state intervention rather than state enablement. China,
and what's the difference?
I think, look, when people look at China, the assumption, often naive assumption, is that the Chinese government has orchestrated this through rigid policy planning and a dogmatic sort of approach to economic management. That's not the case. China's greatest, and I think that's dangerous ground, to be honest. I believe that China's greatest developmental success over the last 3 decades, moving from basket case economy to the world's second largest in 3 decades, has been achieved through enablement of private sector activity. 30 years ago, private sector contribution to GDP was perhaps maybe zero, bordering on 0%. Today, private sector contribution to GDP in China is approximately 70%.
And how does that compare to similar countries? Well, you can't say similar. There's no country like China, but anyway, other countries with large economies.
Well, there's never been a case like this where a country has gone from a relatively, never as rigid as a Soviet model or perhaps even an Ethiopian model in the 80s, but a relatively rigid command economy, a socialist, underpinned by socialist communist sort of economic theory, to what is perhaps the most entrepreneurial economy level and highly competitive and very productive in the global economy today. So that is China's greatest achievement.
We're going to talk lots more about it. The big question then at 2, and I certainly want to get your opinion on this one. Very broad question. What can South Africa learn from China? What can our country learn from China? However you interpret that, I'd like to get your opinion. 0891 104207. 34701 is the SMSs. You can, if you do that, it'll cost you R2. You can also tweet me, Ashraf Garda1, and comment via Facebook too. I'll get to the callers right away. Peter in Umtata. Hi, Peter. Peter, hi.
Yes, I concur with him that, the whole China sort of model, I mean, comparing even to India, they are, at the moment, they're basically on par and they, competing for the commodities of the world. I think we should actually change our mindset from now onwards that, like everyone was always, aspiring to be like America. I think this whole mindset must change. That it's
okay, but therefore specifically
they will become the people to deal with. And listening to this financial guru on RT, I mean they were alluding that China, with the BRICS sort of they actually must shift the economic changes, especially with the capitalist system, basically, completely, in doldrums. They must create an alternative, like either a monetary policy, a financial, global financial institutions that they're not dictated to. I mean, look at what actually America is doing. They want to actually basically undermine the Chinese economy, the Chinese, a model of exports.
Okay.
I mean, the way that they're going around in East Asia, China setting up bases to, destabilizing the whole Asia.
All right, Peter, thanks for that call. Let's get further opinion on that one. Thank you so much. I'll get to Motala in just a second. Some of the SMSs we've had. Let me see. We can learn about no corruption. As was one of the comments. I'll see there's a few more as well. Motala in Durban, let's get to you. Hi.
Hello, how are you?
I'm very good, thank you.
Now, the basic reason is we must adopt and follow the policy followed by China on the time it got independence. Initially, its problems were the same as our problems.
Wait, so when you say in independence...
Of the poor in the rural areas, suffering, unemployed. To solve that, initially what it did, it implemented the communist system, the socialist system of giving them the land, let them cultivate the land to make a living, to solve that problem, which we have not done. And at that time, when they were doing that, the rest of the world was boycotting it economically. It could not develop But they didn't worry. They carried on as long as the majority of the people were making a living and they were happy. Then when they realized that the only way to enter the world is to get Hong Kong, they succeeded in getting Hong Kong. And from Hong Kong, they started trading with the capitalist world. Before, they could not do that. So you need a dual system, a socialist system and a capital, like the Islamic system or any of the religious prophets. They adopted both the capitalist
Okay, and you're
and
saying
the
that's what we
socialist
can
system.
that's what we can learn. Thanks for that, Mutala. Let's just get a comment on that one there. Your thoughts on what the caller said?
Yeah, Ashraf, if I may be intentionally provocative and with respect,
Well,
maybe,
say the way you feel.
maybe disagree with both speakers. I think that it's often too simplistic to say there's an American model and there's a Chinese model, and maybe the third question is, well, what is ours? I think the Chinese, let me talk about the similarities between the US and the China model right now. Both the two probably, in my opinion, the two probably freest labor market systems in the world right now are the Chinese and the Americans. Secondly, there's no other economies that encourage entrepreneurship like the Americans and the Chinese do. Thirdly,
And how do they do that? Just on the entrepreneurship part, because we think we encourage it as well.
well, I think in the Chinese case, it's first and foremost you have 99% of the population is educated and literate. That's obviously the foundation and a necessary start. You're never going to have what's very difficult to have an entrepreneurial economy. Or to create an entrepreneurial economy out of our own, when most of the rhetoric we hear coming out of government and affiliated bodies is ideologically based. Entrepreneurship does not thrive in ideologically socialist-driven societies. The third thing I want to say about the US and China is ideology is redundant. These are totally non-ideological societies. Do not believe the labels when one is looking at the so-called People's Republic of China run by the Chinese Communist Party. The labels are absolutely meaningless. For me, the greatest sort of achievement, perhaps, and one I'm still trying to fully comprehend in China the last 3 decades, is how is an economy that has come from such an ideologically rigid, intense sort of place to one that is entirely entrepreneurial, brutally capitalist and highly competitive. And that again comes to the more I talk about China, the more you're thinking I'm talking about the United States.
And the decision to sort of become capitalist, because some may even say, well, as Mutala said, in fact, they sort of two economies side by side. I mean, is that true? And was there a formal decision? Because I don't think so, to say, well, today we will be less communist, more capitalist, or just straight more capitalist? Or did it actually happen at a time when you and I and the rest of the world didn't even know it? There were sort of gradual changes taking place.
It was a conscious decision taken by or led by at the time by Deng Xiaoping, the paramount leader of China, going back from December 1978 until his death in 1997. He was the sort of founder of a modern economic China, where Chairman Mao Zedong personified political China, Deng Xiaoping personified economic China. And of course, it was a very much of an ideological battle to wage, but he persevered and won through. What Mutala said about the land issue is the land reform came about, and it was not too dissimilar to a Zimbabwe situation in recent years in China post 1949. But land only became productive when it was de facto privatized after 1979. In the first sort of 5-6 years of the early 80s, we saw the de facto privatization of land, or should I rather say incentivization of title deed holders, if you will, to make profit from the land they had. So it's not a success because of the communist system, anything but. It's a success because of a free market one.
Okay, I want to get to the other callers, Pat, Molefe and Rashid, in just a second. The question then about Hong Kong that was thrown in. I mean, my understanding, that was always the term of expiry date, isn't it? Was it 97? I can't
1997, July 1997.
It had to be returned to China.
Well,
was there some horse trading being made to get Hong Kong back, or was it a given that it had to go back anyway?
There was agreement in 1984, the basic law, which was signed at the time between Margaret Thatcher and Deng Xiaoping, whereby Hong Kong would be handed back to PRC, People's Republic of China sovereignty, and the date eventually became 1997. It's a very complex legal issue because from sort of the early 1840s, when the treaty was put in place, ceding Hong Kong to a 150-year period to to the British government, it was only certain geographic parts of Hong Kong. But nevertheless, Hong Kong became almost a single whole. Indeed, so parts were the whole thing was handed back.
But the bigger question there is to what extent has Hong Kong's return to China, despite what the skeptics may have said at that time, has that contributed to the China that we talk about now?
Did China change Hong Kong, or did Hong Kong change China? I think it's clearly the latter. What one of the intangible drivers of development in China, and certainly an intangible determinant of a change of leadership's mindset, was saying, well, we are Chinese people in China. Think China 1970s now, mid-70s. There are hundreds of millions of Chinese people in China. And there are tens of millions of Chinese outside of China.
Of course.
The Chinese in Singapore, the Chinese in Hong Kong, the Chinese in Taiwan, Malaysia, Thailand, even in Canada, United States, are wealthy. But the Chinese in China PLC, are poor. Yeah. What's the problem here? And that realization took place in the late 70s. Hence, that I believe that contributed to the change of that policy.
That's a fascinating way of understanding that, indeed. Okay, let's talk more. We'll get your calls and your opinion on this question. What can South Africa learn from China? Further answers after this.
Afternoon Talk on SAFM.
Right, some of the other SMSs again. One-child policy and workers' rights or lack thereof comes from Peter. It's a question mark, in fact. Another one saying, sorry, South Africa can't learn. Period. Comes from Dumi. Another one saying 2 words, work ethic. Another one talks about no corruption and investment. We can learn everything from China, Japan, South Korea and Germany. Another one saying we can learn to be productive. Charles in Cape Town saying discipline is the key. And goodness, I can go on. There's a couple more that I'll read. I'll do that in just a second. Let's get to the other callers now. Pat in Fishhook. Hi, Pat. Pat, hi.
Hello.
Yes, is that Pat, right?
Good afternoon.
Yes,
I'm calling from Fishhook.
Hi.
I lived in Hong Kong and China for 24 years, and I'd just like to say that, first of all, South Africa has to limit their families, birth control. Education is a privilege in Hong Kong and China, not a right. Hard work just doesn't exist here. The government here should adopt a laissez-faire attitude and stop interfering. People here should respect the rule of law, and they should have pride in their country. And I worked with all those big tigers that they call out there, Japan and
Asian
Korea
tigers.
and so on. And people work extremely hard, which they do not do here. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that. Well, certainly, Pat has got a note or series of notes. I thought the interesting one is about education, where she suggests that it's a privilege, not a right. I mean, that's not something you'd agree with, would you? That it's a privilege in China? You think it's a right, and it's almost like a demand that they excel.
Perhaps a privilege is what one makes of it thereafter.
Yeah. Okay, as opposed to just sort of finishing your work. We're coming to Rashid in a second. Molefi in Pretoria, hi. Hi, Molefi, you're on the air.
Yes, hello, can I?
You're on the air, go for it, Molefi.
Okay, yeah. Now, I'm just referring to the entrepreneurship and the education.
Okay.
According to the GEM report, Global Economic Monitor,
I need you to speak up. We can barely hear you, Molefi. Sorry, man. If you can please speak up.
According to the GEM report,
right?
They're commenting on education as one of the aspects. But there are other aspects that are involved as well, in terms of government support, for example, whether finance or in terms of entrepreneurial environment. Not only education on itself is not the key to succeed. There might be other factors that need to be incorporated. So I'd like you just to comment on that.
Okay, let's get a response.
Secondly, Brazil and India, for example, their environment in terms of entrepreneurship, they're picking up. And as we know, the Indian employees had a lower rate of education, and they're improving it in terms of to help people to understand what entrepreneurship is. And lastly, China is adopting what we call a resource-based view to push the entrepreneurship forward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you much. He's made 3 points. You can pick up on those.
Sorry, I couldn't quite hear all of them, but the issue about entrepreneurship and also education is, China is like the US, is an incredibly competitive society. Another commonality, which I wanted to mention earlier, is both countries have created phenomenal elite institutions of education. The US will have the Harvards, the Stanfords, the Yales. China will have the Fudans, the Tsinghuas, the Beidas, and these universities. And I think despite again, don't believe the labels in China, there's nothing wrong with elitism from a Chinese perspective. I think our notion of entrepreneurship is, China's, I tell you, Ashraf, I may digress for a second, just to give you a bit of an anecdote. The conversation, this was a highlight of mine last year. I had a conversation at Tsinghua University in October last year. It was a professor from the School of Public Policy. He was also a faculty member at Harvard Business School, a Chinese chap. And his day job, he was an advisor also to the Ministry of Commerce, the DTI equivalent in China, on talent. And his whole thesis to me was, over an hour, was that we as Chinese currently have 220 odd million blue collar, relatively lowly educated workers in our economy. We currently have 96 million tertiary white collar educated graduates, 96 million, and we're adding about 10 million a year. And our biggest challenge as this country, from a government perspective, China now, is how do we replace, by 2020, we will have 200 million graduates plus. How do we replace 220 odd million blue collar workers with 200 odd million white collar tertiary educated graduates? The days of China, thinking of China in terms of this sweatshop sort of, are very obsolete. China's rapidly, been through education, largely through this highly competitive environment which is being created, and working 8 hours a day in China, you're simply not competitive.
So we're having, for example, and again, we've got about a minute to go, not to digress too much, but the issue of South Africa in terms of matric pass rates being lower to allow more people to pass, that would be frowned upon, you're saying, in China.
Entirely.
That is not elitist, that's all encompassing, but it actually does nothing.
Every sort of matric equivalent of potentially school leaving student learner in China sits pretty much the same exam. It was actually this week. You have 10 million people sitting exam concurrently. No papers are leaked beforehand. Everyone is ranked, everybody. So if you came 15th in your province, you know where you came. If you came 1 million plus, you know where you came. Highly competitive, highly meritocratic. One last point, the point about work ethic. I don't know this is a Chinese thing, I don't know one great career, company or country which succeeded on 40 hours a week. We need to remember that.
Okay, 40 hours a week, no go. Rashid in Durban, what's your point? Rashid, hi.
Hello.
Yes.
Ashraf?
Yes, sir.
Ashraf, I feel that the attitude of government has got to change. In respect of, a week or two ago, President was asked in Parliament by the leader of the opposition as to what does he feel about government people doing business with the state. And his response was quite surprising, Ashraf, in that he said that, they have a constitutional right as long as their business entities are registered. They have a right to be entrepreneurial. Now, Ashraf, sorry, are you there?
Yes, carry on, please do, quickly.
Yes. In China, if I'm not mistaken, I read that, when government employees do business with the state, they hanged. So I don't know where our government is getting off on,
For that, Rashid, we'll get a response in a second. It's 2:30, maybe just final comments from Dr. Martin Davies. Right, we're going to wrap up on the issue of what can South Africa learn from China. After that, it's Tech Media for the next half an hour. And then we chat to Melinda Bam, the current Miss South Africa, in the spotlight after 3 o'clock. Right, just some comments. You may want to pick up on the last caller, but also you said 40 hours a week, a no-go. That's 5 hours. That's 8 hours a day times 5. What should be the ideal then?
Ashraf, again, just a personal anecdote. I do an enormous amount of work with China and Chinese. And it's not uncommon to receive emails or even telephone calls at China time 2-3 a.m. in the morning. And these are not from BlackBerries, these are from the office. Okay. It's an intense work environment. And, we talk often about 7% growth in this country. We're hearing about it. And despite the fact in 2007, when the global economy was very, very, cooking effectively, we couldn't breach 5.5%. We last got, as a country, we breached 7% in 1967. Yeah, I checked. That's 45 years ago.
Generations ago.
The highest growth ever was 64%. So coming back to your original question, question is, what do we learn from China? China is probably, maybe a few exceptions, I'm thinking maybe South Korea and Taiwan here during the 60s, 70s and 80s, and Singapore as well. But Singapore, Hong Kong, even Taiwan, Taiwan's population is the same as Beijing's. Singapore and Hong Kong are relatively small towns in China. But to achieve 10% growth for 3 decades, of 1 billion people plus, is certainly no mean public sector management feat.
Indeed. All right, and then that last answer, the 40-hour work week, if that's no good?
Look, I think, we have a aspirational developing emerging market economy in our country. But at the same time, we have a regulatory environment that has been largely cut and pasted from a West European model. If our GDP per capita is $30,000, $35,000, $40,000 per head, then we can start thinking about a 35, 40-hour work week. But I'm afraid until then we can't.
Okay, we never touched on the unions and the role they play, but maybe leave that for another time. Appreciate your input, Dr. Martin Davies, the Chief Executive Officer at Frontier Advisory, which is a research strategy and investment advisory firm that assists clients to improve their competitiveness in emerging markets. And according to Martin, he spent lots of time in China.